Okay, my coffee is prepped. Yes, thank you, Ryan. Good morning, guys. Okay, so today our revision lecture is going to be about visual space. This is important for cinematographers in the way that when you set up your shot, you're thinking about how the elements in the shot are creating depth. The same for production designers. I know Mr. Thompson asked some of his production designers to come and join us. Same thing when you're building a set or you're doing your set dressing. One of your considerations is how much depth it's going to have, and I'll explain why that's important a little bit later. There's also, for photography, it's the same thing. For animation, creating that sense of a real world is something that visual space allows you to do. There's endless applications for it. So the aim of this lecture is going to be for you, when you're having your pre-production meetings or you're having your creative meetings, for you to be able to discuss visual space in a way that's constructive, in a way that everybody understands. Because when you go to your creative meeting, you go to your pre-production meeting, you have to go there with the intent to be a team player, with the intent to not only support your own ideas, but support other people's ideas towards the vision of the film. What's going to make a better movie? Your ideas, if you actually listen to someone else, you'll be able to decide which idea is the best. And sometimes it's not your own idea, which is perfectly fine because, like we said, filmmaking is a team sport. So one of your main considerations on what visual space is supposed to do is that when you are making a film, visual space, when you're composing a shot, right? The problem is in real life we have three dimensions. We've got, in math you might remember, you have the x-axis, you have the y-axis, right? But we also have the z-axis, which is x is width, y is height, and z is depth. So the problem is a movie screen at the cinema, or a TV screen, or if you're watching a movie on your phone, heaven forbid, that's only two-dimensional, and it only has an x-axis and it only has a y-axis. So when we are composing a shot and we're filming, we need to fake the z-axis. We need to fake the depth, or we might decide not to fake it. So visual space is a major concern for the stylistic nature of your movie. Okay? And I'm going to discuss the four main spaces now. It's also important to think about it that they don't only occur in isolation. Sometimes in your film, only a sequence or only a scene is in a certain spatial configuration. And this will start making sense to you soon. But the main thing that you need to know when we talk about visual space is that we're talking about how are we faking the z-axis depth to create a three-dimensional sense, a three-dimensional feeling for a movie. So think about it this way, is that z equals depth, but it's not present. It doesn't exist on a screen. So this is going to be our lecture on how to fake depth, how to create three dimensions, how to create contrast. Right? The more contrast a scene has, the more three-dimensional it feels, and also the more dynamic it feels. Right? So you'll see the two main spaces that you get. There's four. But the two most important ones, the rest are in between spaces, is deep space, which is the first one I'll be discussing, and flat space. And if we think of two filmmakers that work at these extremes, is that Michael Bay with all these action movies, uses deep space because he's trying to create those car chases and those bombings, and it needs to feel like they're going to hit you, or it's, you want to feel the visceral action of the space. So he uses, in his films, he predominantly focuses on deep space. Flat space or limited space is Wes Anderson. Right? His movies feel much more stylistic, much more produced. They feel like they're on a theater stage. They feel like they're on the stage, right? And that's done very purposefully. So when you think about deep space, which is the one extreme, think about Michael Bay, right? And action movies and explosions and Transformers. And when you think about flat space, you think about Wes Anderson, which is very stylized, very, very, the camera movement only works in a certain direction. The way the elements are dressed on the set are done very purposefully to make it feel like it's a theater production to a certain extent. Give you that stylistic feeling. So visual space is a complex component. It defines all the visual components on the screen. The decisions you make about how you're going to compose a shot, how you're going to dress the shot, how you're going to use your background, all of those are considerations when it comes to visual space. There are 4 main subcomponents. We discussed the 2. We discussed deep space. We discussed flat space. We also get limited space, which is also more accurately a Wes Anderson thing. And then we get ambiguous space, which is very common in horror films. They're very much dependent on the use of ambiguous space. Okay, so these subcomponents all have to do with the amount of contrast for depth, right? So when you think about space, remember your screen is only 2-dimensional, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to fake depth by adding things called depth cues, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Okay? So, real world is 3D, movies aren't, but that doesn't mean we can't make it feel that way. So deep space is the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface, which is your cell phone screen, movie screen, whatever. It is possible to give your audience experience of seeing and feeling 3 dimensions, so that's width, height and depth, but all of that is an illusion. If you get excited, if you feel like something's going to hit you when you watch a Michael Bay movie, you see a piece of debris flying through the air and you kuss a little bit, right? That is because of Michael Bay's use of deep space. There is never real depth on the screen, right? The picture is consistently 2-dimensional, but that doesn't mean it can't immerse you. How many of you have watched an action movie or watched a horror movie and you were completely immersed, you forgot where you were and you got big skrik, right? And that a lot of that has to do with the filmmaker's use of visual space. The audience believes they see depth on that 2-dimensional screen, and we're going to talk about how do we do that. So the first one I'm going to discuss is deep space, because it's the most important. Not the most important, but it's the most difficult one to do, or the one that has the most elements, because as we go down them, right, we're removing these elements. These elements that I'm talking about are called depth cues, right? Depth cues, and this is where things start to get interesting. Deep space, or the illusion of depth, is created by controlling these depth cues. And they're visual elements that create this illusion that the 2-dimensional screen is 3-dimensional, right? So one of these depth cues is perspective. And if you guys are interested, later on I'll do a lecture about single point perspective and 2-point perspective and 3-point perspective and so on. But just so that you know, when you're creating depth on a flat screen, it is essential to know how to recognize perspective in the real world. When you look at a skyscraper and you see it go small to that single point up in the sky, right? It makes you feel small. That is a depth cue, right? So perspective is one of our depth cues. If we look at a flat wall, for example, right? So here's a flat wall. If we look at this flat wall, we don't have a sense of scale. We don't have a sense of size because there's no perspective. It's just flat there and flat there, right? So if we look at a frontal plane, visually, the frontal plane of my window and the wall has no depth and can't be given the appearance of depth if we don't add perspective. For our purposes, perspective comes in three basic types, right? You get more, but these are three basic ones that we're going to be speaking about. Is you get 1 point perspective or single point perspective. You get 2 point perspective and 3 point perspective. Those are the ones you're going to be using in film most often, right? So perspective is one of our depth cues. The next one is size difference. Okay, an object of a known size gets smaller when it appears further away, as an object of known as a larger size appears closer. So when we place elements on a screen, right, if we know, for example, a horse is bigger than a person, which is a very simple example, right? Our mind creates sizes within the visual space that we see for those two things. So the further away I put something in the screen, the smaller it's going to look. And the closer I put a big thing, the bigger it's going to look, right? So in movies like Dunkirk, for example, they would print cars on flats, right? And they wouldn't be full size, but they put them closer to the film plane. And they'd slightly slant them so that when you watch the movie, right, they look much bigger than they actually are. And that plays with the size difference, because when that printed car, this is a printed car, is put relative to this person, because we know a car is a certain size and we relatively put him to this person, that car, our brain decides what size that car actually is. Physically, the car that's printed on that flat is maybe half the size of what that truck is. But because we place it inside the frame to a relative distance to a person who we know what size a person is, that car now appears to be bigger. Does that make sense? This shot has depth. That sort of shot has depth because we stagger it on the three different planes, right? So we put our car. We have three different planes in a scene. We have a foreground, a background, and a midground, right? The midground is usually your area of action when you're filming motion. But we place that person on the foreground and we place the car in the background, covering in the midground, covering our background. And our brain will tell us that this car is bigger. So size difference is a perceptual concern and not a physical concern. You don't need a big car to make it look like a big car, right? In Lord of the Rings, you see this quite often as well, where they make, or Harry Potter, where they make Hagrid look like a giant. They like to play with our perception of size differences, right? So they'll make teacups that are a lot smaller and put in his hand so he looks bigger. So size difference is another depth cue. Then movement is another depth cue. The way we use movement in our scene also creates depth. Moving an object in front of the camera, or by moving the camera itself, we create movement, right? And we'll be discussing that later in our lectures a lot more. But an object can be anything that's in front of the camera. It can be a person, an animal, a ball, whatever. It doesn't make any difference. But if we go back to our three planes, our foreground, midground, and background, right? If we have elements moving in the background, and we have elements moving in the foreground, and we have two characters having a conversation in the midground, it is going to feel to us like there's a lot more depth, because we're going to have people walking in front of them and we're going to have people walking in the background. So those are depth cues that tell your brain that, hey, there is depth, there's Z to this space that we're playing in. So in our depth cue so far, we've got perspective, we've got size difference, and then we've got movement. Okay, I don't want to make this lecture too long, so I'm not going to go into everything about movement because there is a lot. But this is basically the basic that you need to understand why it creates this idea of depth in your mind. The next depth cue is textural diffusion. So if you have watched any superhero movie in the last 10 years, you'll notice that their suits always have a texture on it. If you look at Henry Cavill's Superman suit, even the logo on his chest is it's got a lot of texture. The whole suit through has a different texture. Batman's suit, who else? Captain America, for example, is a great example where they play with different textures and different things, right? So every object has texture and detail. The camera loves texture, right? So a plain wall with a smooth texture and almost no detail, and then you think of Captain America or Superman's suit with that nubbly texture, right? Depth gets created by different textures standing against different textures, and also they just look a lot better on camera. The camera loves to see texture. I've often seen costume tests, and you have a look at this costume or you have a look at the set, and Mr. Reed Thompson, we've had this discussion before when you shot your honors movie and you had those walls painted, and we're like, okay, we just need a little bit of texture there, and to the eye it might not look that great, might even look tacky, but when you put it on camera, it looks amazing. It really looks like it's got depth. It looks like the world is lived in, right? And that's how we achieve these depth cues. That's how we're achieving deep space, is by adding texture to things. That can be costumes, that can be wallpaper, it can be your choice of fabrics for the couch that you use, right? And when you're the cinematographer, you're thinking about, okay, did I light this properly? Am I highlighting the texture? Do I have these elements in my shot, right? If I'm shooting in deep space. So textural diffusion is a great way to create depth, right? Textural diffusion doesn't only have to be props, it can also be people, right? If you go to a stadium and there's tons of people sitting there, they all have different textures and different shirts and all these different things, right? Those fans sitting in the background get reduced to tiny dots as they fall off into the distance, but those objects have more textural detail, right? So it makes the scene very interesting. It's also, those dots have less textual detail, right? Because you can see less detail in them. And as you move forward and you see the characters sitting in the front of you, and you can see this guy's jersey, and you can see this guy's rugby jersey, and you can see the other guy's jacket, they've got more textural diffusion. So they appear closer because you can see more textures on them, right? So textural diffusion is our other depth cue. Aerial diffusion is the next one. Now this one is something you all know. If you look into the distance and you look at the mountains, and you can see it's, they just become the soft haziness as they fall into the background. That is called aerial diffusion, right? And the way the human brain has evolved is that when we see aerial diffusion, we know something is in the distance. So aerial diffusion is dependent on particulates in the air, right? These particles can be dust, they can be fog, they can be rain, smog, smoke, right? They create a density to the air, right? And anything suspended in that air that makes the background kind of fall off and become diffused and blurry, and it's got that smoky quality to it, right? That is actually quite great. So, where are we now? Okay, so those are some of our depth cues. Aerial diffusion causes 3 visual changes in your picture, right? That they create this illusion of depth. They create the loss of detail. What else? There's a tonal difference, right? You know, the further back it goes, the lighter the colors look. That's a tonal difference. Not the contrast. The contrast falls off, becomes lighter in the difference, because I shouldn't say it's a color difference, because color difference is one of those things. It's that blue becomes light blue as we go on. So the third thing that changes is the color difference. So when we're talking about aerial diffusion, 3 visual changes happen when we have aerial diffusion. We add smoke or fog or anything to a scene. Is we have a loss of detail, we have a tonal difference, and we have a color difference. Right? So that's aerial diffusion. The loss of textural detail due to aerial diffusion seems similar to textural diffusion if you really think about it. And that is true, but the causes are different. So for our sake, we're going to differentiate between those two. Textural diffusion relies on the actual distance to produce a loss in detail. Aerial diffusion does not rely on the actual distance, but rather the particulates in the air, which obscure textural detail and make them seem further away. So the more it gets distorted in the background, the more your brain knows, hey, that thing is further away. So when we talk about depth cues, it's very much all about making the brain think things, right? We're playing with the perception of the mind. I'm just having a sip of coffee. Are you guys still okay? We've still got a few more depth cues to go through. Are there any questions about those depth cues so far? Perspective, size difference, movement, textural diffusion, and aerial diffusion. Okay, if not, then I'm just going to do shape change is the next depth cue. Okay, shape change. So shape change links up with movement, right? So think about it this way. Because objects move in the foreground, midground, and background, I know there's depth to the scene. Shape change is similar. An object's shape change is perceived as a cue of depth in your brain. Okay? Shape change can occur when an object is moving or an object is moving in relation to other stationary objects, right? So if you take my hand, right, and you reduce it to a silhouette, right, and I show you the same hand in different shapes, right? In the real world, the hand would change its shape during a rotation. So any turning object, right, because it's turning, it tells your brain that it has a third dimension. Does that make sense? So in the rotation, your brain goes, oh, it's moving, therefore it needs to have depth, right? So especially bulbous objects like a hand or whatever, the more it moves, as the object turns in the real world, it changes shape in the screen world. And that shape change is what creates our next depth cue. Okay. So where are we next? Our next depth cue is tonal separation. This also happens during aerial diffusion. Tonal separation refers to black and white and the grayscale. Grayscale contains no color. So it's a series of tonal steps, right? So here we have a bunch of tonal steps. This is absolutely black, if you pretend. This is white, very white, right? And then it becomes more and more light. So this is our tonal steps from black to white. Tonal separation deals with the viewer's perception of a depth cue to the brightness of an object. Usually lighter objects, the lighter an object is, the closer they appear, and the darker an object is, the further they appear. So lighter means closer, something's light, your brain relatively tells you it's closer, and darker is further away. Okay, now this has a lot to do with how you light a set. There's a wonderful, wait, let me just see if I can find this example. I have it in a textbook here somewhere. Okay, so yeah, here it is. If you look at this door, okay, see that door, right? That door is in a certain location, right? So now you've seen that door. Now I'm going to show you the same door. Okay, now tell me quickly, which door seemed further away and which door seemed closer? I'll show you the two doors again quickly. First door, second door. Okay, what do you guys think? Is the white door closer or is the black door closer? Does it seem to you that way? Okay, so generally the response is that the white door seems closer than the black door. In actual fact, both doors are in exactly the identical place. They're the identical size. Nothing changed, only the tonal difference. One is white, so it seems closer. The one is black, so it seems further away. Okay, the next depth cue is color separation. Right, colors can be used as a depth cue by classifying them in warm and cool groups. So when we think about depth cues, it's warm or cool. Warm colors are red, orange, yellow, and cool colors are like blue and green. Yeah, there's a lot about color theory, so I'm not going to talk about that now, but what I am going to talk about is how warm colors usually seem to be closer and colder colors seem further away. Do you believe me? You should. So I'm going to show you two pictures again. That is the same door as a warm color. Okay, have a look at it. And the same door as a cool color. Okay, does the blue door seem further away? Does the red door seem closer? Okay, the red triangle should seem closer and the blue rectangle should seem further away, even though both are the same distance to the viewer, which is you. There are many theories why this happens. One of them is that researchers believe it's linked to human psychology and physiological responses to different wavelengths of light. We can't really prove this because you can't go into people's minds, but the theory is, whatever the reason, the particular fact exists that one can be used to create deep space and the other one can be used to create flat space. Thank you. Matthew says yes. The next depth cue that we have is the up and down position. Okay, so this might seem untrue, but it is 100% accurate. Yeah, Orion, if you think of light as where color comes from, yeah, it definitely is. But the human brain is very interesting, especially our relationship, our mental relationship to the color red, because it's a survival. Blood is red, so there's a survival imperative every time we see the color red. So it's very interesting. But back to the up and down position as a depth cue. The vertical location of an object in the frame affects their apparent distance to the viewer. Objects higher in this frame appears further away, and objects lower in the frame seem closer. So when it comes to the up and down position, up means further away, and down makes your brain seem to think that it's closer. So I'm going to show you another picture. Okay, so we have these two women standing there. One is at the top of the frame, one is at the bottom of the frame, and then we've put an element in there. So even though these two people are the same size, you might perceive the person lower in the frame to be more in the foreground, right? So closer to you. If there is a horizon line in the frame and the up and down position, the up and down position cue becomes more complex because your brain now also considers the horizon. So objects closer to the horizon will appear more distant, and objects further away from the horizon will seem closer. So when it comes to up and down position, your horizon zone becomes a reference point for your brain. So does it seem to you that the woman, they're both the same size, they're both the same distance from you, but does it seem to you that the woman in the bottom corner seems closer? And the woman at the top corner seems further away, even though they're not. It's just your brain trying to make sense of the depth cue. So here's another example of what happens to your brain when the horizon line is introduced into this equation. Right? So even though they're the same size, your brain tells you those elements are near and those elements are further away. Okay. Okay, so another depth cue is overlap. Ugh. So when overlap occurs, there's a sense of depth in your scene. So for example, we've got Captain America down here, right? That's flat space, more or less. Not really, because we do have a little bit of perspective because of this line in the background there. But when there's a little bit of overlap, when my pen is over his head, right, much more depth is introduced into the scene now, right? Because I know my brain can tell me what the distance is, right? So the overlap creates depth because the object must be closer than the object it overlaps, right? So your brain tells you, because this pen is overlapping over Captain America, the pen has to be closer than Captain America. So in cinematography, that is, overlap is very useful in creating that depth. If you watch an action sequence, like a car chase or any James Bond movie, you'll often see purposeful elements of overlap put into the frame so that it feels more kinetic, there's more contrast in the scene. So overlapping objects create more depth than the objects without overlap. In most cases, overlap is a minor depth cue, right? It's a small thing, right? But when all these small things add up, when all these depth cues add up, they create these massively immersive, kinetically action-packed sequences. So the overlapping objects must display other major depth cues before they can actually overlap to add that depth. So in our Captain America example, I've got a horizon line in the background. We've got tonal differences between the board and the table, and we have a depth cue, right? So that suddenly creates all this contrast and becomes this major depth cue, which if I only had this, right, the depth cue is not as severe, which is quite obvious, but also good to know. So here we've got a nice example of how powerful all these depth cues can be when they're put together. I mean, that hallway feels like it goes on forever and ever and ever. Okay, so another depth cue is focus, right? If things are in focus, what is focus? That is the sharpness of things in picture. Objects can be in sharp focus or they can be in low depth of field. As a depth cue goes out of focus, it loses deep spacing characteristics and becomes flat or limited. So if you're shooting shallow, right, you're taking away a depth cue, right? Only the person in the scene feels like it's got any significance in the frame. It's got any depth cues. If you watch movies like The Revenant, right, they shoot deep and they shoot deep focus for a reason, and the reason is to make that jungle they're trapped in feel so vast and kinetic, and you can really feel the movement and all those things. So depth cues, I'm just going to run through them quickly. So if you want to create deep space, if you want to have a lot of contrast, if you want to make it your frame and your set feel very three-dimensional, you add perspective, you add size difference, you add movement, you add textural diffusion, you add aerial diffusion, you add shape changes, right, by making things rotate and move. You add tonal separation, which is the distance between black and white. You add color separation, which is adding different colors. You add up and down position. You add overlap, and you think about what focus you use, right? So this cinematographers should know this very well. F2 has a lot less depth, speaking about your aperture, than F11, right? That's going to give you more depth cues, and you'll see action movies are shot on much deeper, generally, right? Not always. There's no such thing as always in filmmaking. So that these elements create deep space. So what happens now for us is, as you take elements away, you start moving into the other spatial areas, right? So deep space, the more of these elements you have, the more deep space you have, right? The more you're working in deep space. So the more you're working in Michael Bay territory. The less, so when you take these elements away, the less elements you have, the closer you're going to get to flat space. So these are two extremes. This is deep space. And then all the way down here is flat space. And then we have limited and ambiguous, right? And this is a sliding scale between flat space and deep space. So the more elements we have, the more deep space it is. The less we have, the more flat space it is. And then somewhere along the sliding scale, we're going to land on limited space, or we're going to land on ambiguous space. So ambiguous space, like I said at the beginning of the lecture, very big for horror. Limited space is much more stylistic, right? All of this is style choices, really, when you're thinking about your movie. So flat space is the next one we're going to talk about, and this is the opposite of deep space. right? It is the actual 2D space of the object or the screen. No depth illusion is created. So when we try and shoot flat space, we try and take as many of these things away as possible. To achieve this effect, the camera must be kept on a frontal to all the objects, and all the objects need to be positioned parallel to the camera. This avoids size difference, this avoids perspective, this avoids depth movement or Z movement, moving, so if your character moves from the back of your scene to the front of your scene, his size is going to change. You don't want that. So you want them to move parallel to the camera so their size stays consistent, right? So you're moving all these depth cues. Another way to move flat space is to avoid object movement perpendicular to the cameras, which we've been speaking about. Keep all movement parallel. You can use pans and zooms and tilts, right? These don't create any depth cues because all the objects move in unison together. Their perspective, their cues all change together, because when it comes to deep space, it's all about contrast, it's all about differences. So there's no relative movement if you use a zoom, or when you use a tilt, or when you use a pan, because everything gets larger and smaller simultaneously. So other ways to maintain flat space is to have a detailed background overwhelming the aerial diffusion, right? So you've got a lot of elements. You've got a very busy wallpaper if you're a production designer. No difference in tone, so everything is sort of a monotone. You use singular colors. All the objects are the same height. You make sure there's no overlap, and you blur objects. So you shoot at f2, right, purposefully, and that will give you a very flat image. So you can think of the Grand Budapest Hotel as many scenes that are definitely flat space, right? Again, these things don't. Usually you won't have a whole movie in deep space. You won't have a whole movie in flat space, right? You'd be moving some sequences, some scenes would be deep, some would be flat. Some would be ambiguous and some would be limited, right? So don't think, hey, I now need to go make my entire movie like this. It really depends on what the scene needs from you. So limited space is the next one we need to talk about. It is in between, if we look at the scale, it is in between flat space and deep space, right? It can only use frontal planes. It can only use movement parallel to the camera. It eliminates two of the strongest deep space visual cues, which are those two. You can maintain any other element mentioned before to create the sense of depth. So you can use some of those, right? For example, using multiple frontal planes with different sizes and tonal separations would be limited space. Think of it as 2 or 3 elaborately placed layers of glass in front of the camera. So again, in Grand Budapest Hotel, you definitely have some scenes that are flat space, and you definitely have some scenes that are limited space. If you think of the Darjeeling Limited, also a Wes Anderson movie, a lot more use of limited space there than flat space. And then lastly, we've got ambiguous space, right? Which relies on creating a sense of anxiety. Like I said, it's for horror. It creates tension. It creates a tense mood, right? Think of movies like Speed. Think of movies like the Saw movies, Quiet Place, movies like that. They like to use ambiguous space to create this tension. The tense mood comes from being unable to identify the size and relation of objects in the screen, and is often achieved by tonal and textural camouflage. So shadows and lights, we're shooting high key, we're hiding things in the shadows, we're using mirrors and reflections to disorientate camera angles, we use Dutch angles. I know students in first year always want to use Dutch angles. If you're shooting ambiguous space, now you've got an excuse to do it. And it is noted that for the effect to work, the objects must be of unknown size. So you're taking away size difference, right? Removing size difference is a big way to make sure you're shooting in ambiguous space. So those are the 4 spaces. Now you need to ask yourself, how do I control these spaces during filming? How do I control them during production? So for the cinematographer, he's going to be considering how he's going to be filming these elements. For the production designer, he's going to be thinking about how he's dressing the set or how he's built the set using these elements. The editor is going to make sure the shots that they select during assembly are shots that contain these elements in them, right? So I'm going to be talking about the two main ones, right? And you can infer the differences for limited and ambiguous space. But in deep space, you want to emphasize longitudinal planes, right? I want to see perspective. You want to use size change. You want to arrange objects perpendicular to the camera. Small in the background, large elements in the foreground. You keep movement perpendicular, right? So lots of you moving into the space, you're coming out of the space. Move the camera and link the movement with a dramatic purpose. So blocking becomes really important when you think about deep space. Our third years at the moment, we had a very in-depth blocking lecture about how to use toppers and tails and elements that move in front of the screen and back in the screen, and using pockets of action. And those elements, those are all very important for shooting deep space. You want to make sure you're using tonal separation. You want high contrast scenes. You want characters moving from light to dark. You want characters moving from warm to cold colors. So mixing color temperatures helps you add deep space. Shooting very bright exteriors with very dark shadows helps you create deep space. And for cinematographers, deep space, using a wider lens, wide angle lens, helps you shoot deep space. Simple reason is because I can see more information in my frame, right? It makes more sense to me because I can see more things, right? So the more I can see, the more detail I can see, the more depth cues my brain can then assimilate and tell me there's depth in a scene. So those are the 5 main things I would say you want to use to create depth during your production or during your shoot. If you want to shoot flat space, you almost want to do the opposite. So you want to eliminate longitudinal planes. You want your characters only to move horizontally. You want to stage objects parallel to the picture plane. So all movement moves parallel, right? Goes in hand with what we were just saying. You don't want to use dolly or crane movements. You'd rather use pans or zooms, right? For the reason that size differences all happen simultaneously, right? You want to remove any tonal separation. So you want to shoot analogous or very monotype color schemes. You want everything to be as close to one color as possible. You'd use shallow depth of field to shoot at f2 or 1.8 or 1.2 if you can, which is a nightmare if there's movement anyway. So if you want to shoot flat space, it's better to do that because your movement's so limited. So it doesn't take you forever to get a shot. And then you want to use a telephoto lens. So anything from 50 and above. 50 is okay, but 70, 85, 100, 130, those are focal lengths that compress the space anyway because of the lens compression. And they take away all these depth cues, especially when you're shooting shallow. And that should allow you to have a very flat space that feels very theatrical, that feels very stylized, feels very Wes Anderson-like, right? And if you do the opposite, you get depth cues and you go to the exact opposite director. Michael Bay styles like depth cues. All superhero movies, when they shoot action sequences, that's all shot in deep space. Car chases, Fast and Furious, they all use deep space. So this is the way you would make sure you have the most contrast, visual cues, depth cues in your scene and creates the most dynamic, most exciting image, right? Where you're focusing on action, and the closer you go to deep space, the more you're going to have strong actors. You're more focusing on performances. You're more focusing on character development, right? Dialogue becomes emphasized when we shoot flat space or limited space. So that's another consideration. Do I have Do I have actors that are strong enough to do that? Okay, so that is visual space. That's the lecture for today. I'm going to have a sip of coffee, and then you tell me if there are any questions. Neville, any questions? Ross, do you have a question? Marie, Ryan? Ryan's waving at me. That's not a question. Ruan has joined us right at the end. Okay, is there anything you guys want me to explain again or run through you again? Does everybody understand the depth cues? Does that make sense to everybody? Will this be on the portal? Probably not. It is actually on the second year's portal, something similar to this, not as much detail. But there is on the cinematography 2 on the after portal, there is something for you. Ross, you're very quiet, no questions. That's not like you. Okay, well, if there are no questions, then that's going to be it. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry. Yeah, so thank you guys. If you have any questions, we'll be doing another one soon. If you have any questions for or any requests for revision lectures, you're welcome to send me a message and just ask. I am still available 24/7. Well, not 24/7, don't go nuts. Okay, so thank you very much, guys. I'll see you soon. Keep safe and corona free. Bye-bye.